This is the Pro Audio Suite podcast. Quick Bites.
Welcome to another Pro Audio Suite Quick Bite, thanks to Harlan Hogan's VoiceOver Essentials, the home of the Portabooth Pro and Rode microphones. Speaking of microphones, there's been a lot of talk, in fact, about the SM7, SM7b, probably inspired by all the podcasts that are being done, and of course, who could forget the movie from Metallica. Now we're joined again with Des DeKeen, and I know, Des, you are, excuse pun, DeKeen on the SM7.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't sleep with one under my pillow, but...
It's not what I've heard.
I've been a long time lover of the Shure SM7 and introduced those into the radio network here in Australia, which I was responsible for, the Austereo network. And I'm proud to say that there was a bit of copycat going on around the industry with others also adopting the microphone. There was, I guess the other one that dominated in that period of time was the RE20, the EV, which I wasn't such a fan of because I didn't think it had the warmth of the sound that the SM7 had. So I really wanted that nice personal warm sound.
Yeah, because that RE20 has a design that's designed to kind of counteract proximity effect, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you can't really work it. You just kind of get in front of it and talk. It doesn't really let you do that.
There was a term years ago, they used to call it mugging the microphone, where you would get right onto the mic, and you get the bottom end tip up, which was...
Right. We say eating the mic.
Swallowing it, in fact.
Yes.
I think the other thing about the SM7 or SM7b, which I thought would have been part of your reasoning for putting them in radio studios, is that most people that work in radio stations, particularly jocks, have no care whatsoever about the gear.
Like taking care of it, being thoughtful of how they use it. Is that what you mean?
Chucking stuff around and that kind of thing. Yeah. Was that part of the consideration?
Not really, but it probably was a side benefit, if you like, because they are a good, solidly built microphone. With the only problem being, the foam windsock has a finite life and needs to be replaced occasionally. But that aside, they were really good. I reckon I had some cases of cigarette burns.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yes.
Sure, it was cigarettes, Des?
that as well.
Now, do you use them with the big muff or the smaller muff? I think they have two different windscreens, right?
Yeah, no, we always just used the smaller one, the standard issue one.
Yeah.
And we had in some cases, particularly in talk-only studios, we would switch in the little presence peak, which just kind of gave that little bit of extra lift to the voice quality.
Yeah.
So we used it sometimes, and that was a nice little feature to have.
We have a bit of a contingent of podcast listeners or podcast producers and recorders who tune into our show. That presence lift is sort of it plays with the top end, doesn't it? If you were in a home situation where maybe your acoustics weren't so good, would you still switch that in, or would you leave that alone?
You would have to try it, I think. There's so many variables in that situation. I think it's just a matter of trying it. The lift is really in the voice frequency range, so it's ideal to lift the cut through, if you like, of voice if it's necessary. You probably wouldn't use it on a female voice. You'd be more inclined to use it on a male voice.
Yeah,
I'd suggest.
Yeah.
Yep.
They also have a built-in pop card, which I don't know how good your memory is, Des, but I managed to pop that microphone on air one night, and some guy called you the next day and complained because I blew the driver in his Wharfdale speaker.
Ooh.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Do you remember that, Des?
I do, yes. He was a guy living in the hills here, yeah. Yes, I had completely forgotten that, I've got to say.
What the hell can I just, as a side note here, how the hell did you pop an SM7?
With somebody.
You must have been halfway down your gob. Well, actually, no, that's not true, because then you couldn't have popped. But geez,
Yeah, that's right.
And of course, the guy must have been running a hell of a bass boost on
Yeah.
his system.
I tell you what.
Sure.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we had tri-band processing. Went to Optimods in later days as the on-air processing, and I do pride myself in being a bit of a whiz in setting up an Optimod. I could get it cleaner and louder than anyone else on the band. That was yet another game we used to play.
Mm-hmm.
Make it louder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was actually having this conversation with AP last night. Here's a question for you. When I went to Newcastle to 2NX as they were going from the AM band to the FM band, and we were setting up the FM transmitter. And long story short, we had me in my car. The boss, the owner of the station, was in his car. We had a couple of the jocks at home listening on home stereos, all sort of giving feedback on what they thought it sounded like. So we could dial in the Optimod. And it always occurred to me, even back in those days, we're talking early 90s, that it was a pretty haphazard way of doing it. How do you do it? What are you listening on? How do you dial it in?
Good question. I'm listening.
Okay. Well, it leads me into a little story, if I could indulge for a moment.
Absolutely.
So our station the Austereo station in Brisbane initially was 4BK, an AM station, and that was converting to FM to become B105. The existing only commercial FM station in the market was 4MMM. So we were about to, it was a few nights before we were going to air. I wanted to set up the processing. So I had a guy in the record library. I had a runner, and I had myself in the control room, and we tuned in to Triple M on our control room receiver. Listened to that. Whatever song they played, we dashed in. So this is pre audio storage systems. Whatever song they played, we grabbed it from the library and started playing it. And I would start adjusting the processing to get the sound to match theirs. And I'm switching between B105 test transmission and Triple M, playing we were playing the same song as they were. So after it took me a couple of hours, and the first night I got us sounding the same as them. You couldn't tell the difference when I switched from one to the other. And the second night we did the same process again, and I got us louder and cleaner than them. It's a long process, and the golden rule is adjust a little bit and listen a lot, because you've got so many things to deal with. You've got music, which is pre-processed. You've got live announcer, which is raw audio. You've got a male announcer, female announcer. You've got commercials that are processed. So you've got to listen across a plethora of things before you can really get it right. And the other aspect is, as you rightly asked, Robbo, what do you listen on? Well, you listen on a variety of things. Certainly, I started out with the control room monitoring speakers, which are good wide range. They were 10 8s, I think they were, in that control room. And then you start listening on a couple of radios where you could easily switch between the two stations. So that was all part of it. You establish a bit of a setup procedure, if you like, or a snapshot of what sounds fairly right, and it, in a sense, becomes a bit of a signature of the station. So I did have that down pretty well, what was the Austereo sound, if you like. And yes, it's just an arduous process. But that was the process I went through on that occasion, which I was very lucky to have that opportunity with 2 stations on air. So you're listening to the transmitted signal of the opposition, and you can tune to match that, as I did in the first session, and in the second session, I improved on it by getting us louder and cleaner. So,
how did you manage to get louder?
Sorry, Andrew.
Compression.
Oh, compression. You get louder with compression. Is that correct?
yes, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, George.
Yeah. The art with compression, however, is to compress but don't sound compressed.
Yes.
Yes. You don't want to suck up, and when a drop pauses, you don't want any of those terrible side effects, dragging up breath noises and so on. And gating, of course, which was part of the Optimod equipment. But again, it's a box full of variables, so you've got to get the variables right. They've got some presets in there which you can dial up, rock music and go with that. But they're pretty bland. You can get a much hotter sound if you know what you're doing and take the time to work through getting it right.
So when you say taking your time and doing it right, it takes days, maybe weeks. This is obviously happening. The station is on the air, so you're essentially doing all your experiments, live.
Yeah, in a live situation, yeah.
Yeah.
But
you can't go too far with any one setting and go off the rails, because this is really, really live, right?
Yeah. And you shouldn't need to, George. Really, if you're on air making huge changes, then you haven't done your base work.
That's right.
Really, I'm talking about just nuances here, and it's just a little trim here, a little bit there. Okay, so I've tightened up the top end a little bit, so now I can maybe bring the overall level up just a little bit more, just a smidge. And
well, would you practice with an Optimod? Did you have an Optimod in your own personal control room, so you could really kind of learn that thing?
Just got one in his car.
Well, I know they're like 10. They're quite expensive boxes, but
they are. No, I didn't. It was just having because we were doing some conversions from AM to FM, so you had a test transmission period running on air. So that was the learning ground, really.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it's interesting. My son is chief engineer for a network of regional stations here in South Australia, and they're just. He's currently, as we speak, he's up in the Riverland installing FM transmitters there for 5RM at Renmark to go over to FM. Later this year, and he's also been doing other country towns around South Australia. So we'll have a bit of a chat about that, because in some markets there's a competitive signal there. So I'll have a bit of a chat with him about processing. And
do you get any phone calls, Des, in the middle of the night? Hey, Dad, how do I do this?
Yeah, well, here's a funny story. Talking about hand-me-down equipment. So I was senior technician at 5KA here, and they had some very old transmitters made by RCA. No, they weren't. Sorry, they were STC transmitters. And they later, when they upgraded the transmitters here in Adelaide, they shipped the other ones up to the country towns. Go forward 35 years, and my son Shane is looking after these same stations, and he's got the same transmitter. I told him over the phone how to tune it up.
There you go.
But there's another story, I think, with Shane, because wasn't he part of? Didn't he go into the SAFM when that was being demolished on Green Hill Road?
He did, yes.
And that was the station you built, and then your son's in there as it comes down.
Oh, no.
Yes. Yeah, so he was part of the technology team here, and they because they had to clear the building out, they were all set up and on air from the new building. So Shane was sent over to manage the demolition and cleanup. So he pulled my control room to bits and my studios.
Well, I was downstairs at Triple M when we moved in there. So my old production studio I had a hand in building. When I say had a hand in, I was the production manager there. So we were making decisions and stuff. He would have torn that down too then.
He did, yes. Yeah.
Wow, what a great room that was. Massive big booth downstairs. I don't know if you remember, Des, at Triple M in Adelaide there on Green Hill Road.
Yes.
Huge big booth.
I do.
Used to love it. There you go.
Yeah.
Hey, one or two quick questions before we end this episode. I know we started out talking about mics, but now now we've got into this tangent. You've got me fascinated. The first question is about digital radio, and this is something that always has me scratching my head. And maybe you can or can't answer this, but we went to digital radio in this whole thing of sounds better, all the rest of it, almost a sort of mirror image of what happened when FM started. But when you go into stores or whatever and you look to buy an FM receiver, it's this plastic cased one speaker thing that sounds like my grandma's old transistor radio that used to sit on her kitchen table when I was, 8, 9 or 10.
And in some cases looks like it too.
It does. That's right.
The retro.
It's always fascinated me when we put so much effort into digital radio. As a sort of an engineer who was probably on the end of setting all that up, does it disappoint you a little bit that we haven't sort of made the most of? Well, in my opinion, we haven't made the most of the digital domain.
Yes, look, I've got a very long history with digital radio. I wore the dubious title eventually of the father of digital radio in Australia. But I started travelling to Europe in the early 80s or mid-80s, visiting the BBC research laboratories and in the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, both of which were working on development of audio compression ratios and digital radio transmission as a whole. And I was reporting to the Minister for Communications of the day, and through Austereo and I guess some of my actions and my reporting, we encouraged the ultimate introduction of digital radio into Australia. But we had to develop, because Helen Coonan, who was the Minister for Communications at the time, and back in the press lately, not in such a good way, she only allocated a small band of frequencies to be used in Australia. So I went to Europe to a World DAB conference with people from Commercial Radio Australia, and we talked about producing a more efficient version of DAB, which came to fruition as DAB Plus, which uses AAC or MP4 compression on the audio, which allowed us to achieve a better quality sound in a lower spectrum capacity. So that was the way DAB Plus developed. The receivers, unfortunately, because they're not manufactured in Australia, we're very much in the hands of what is being manufactured. The English people play a big part in receiver manufacture, and they still like the single speaker units. The good thing is, and the saving grace for them, is most of them have a headphone jack on them. And if you plug that into your stereo, you get beautiful, clean, full range digital sound. So you can use one of those little radios. I do in some places around the house here. Feed them into a better speaker, and you get your full quality sound. So it's available at least via the headphone jack. Yeah.
Sure.
And you can buy stereo units with the two speakers, but they're $500 units, which is getting up there a bit.
Surprised we haven't seen it more in cars yet either. It seems to be taking its time getting in there, doesn't it?
Yes, it's moving slowly. There's a push on at the moment to do that. There's something like 40% of cars coming into Australia now have manufacturer-installed digital radios, so it's improving. It started out as just the high-end models of Beamers and Mercs and so on, but it's spread down through the range fairly well now, and we are seeing a reasonable number of in-car radios in Australia.
My 2015 Subaru has a digital or HD radio function.
Oh, right. So, you've got the HD, the American standard, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it seamlessly shifts between them, and there's a dramatic difference in fidelity as it goes between them. It's interesting how, the stations have to sync the two up, and sometimes they're not perfectly in sync. So when they switch over, they're slightly out of whack, but it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yes, it's quite a different system, the American system, and I guess we're going off in an area which may or may not be a conversation for another time.
No, but you've got me fascinated being a radio boy. You've got me fascinated now.
We love our tangents.
One question that does get bandied around on this podcast a bit, and another imaging podcast that I work on, MP3 on FM/digital radio. Des, your thoughts? Is it a broadcast format, MP3, or is that purely the domain of WAV files, AAC files, etc.?
Well, it's an MP4 for that's the transmission system. If we're talking about recording and interchange of material, definitely not. No, it's got to be WAV files for sure. Mm-hmm. Compressed because a compressed file coming in at the beginning of the chain, if you like, it's going to go through a whole lot of processes before it gets to air. It'll go through probably about another 3 or 4 stages of compression. So you've got to start out really clean, because the artifacts that you finish up with at the other end are getting intolerable. Let me explain. So the hard disk storage system in some stations, storage is cheaper now, I must admit. So everyone's pretty much storing full bandwidth. I know we used to store compressed files on our music playout systems in the early days. Hopefully no one's doing that now. When you go onto the microwave link or a radio link to transport your program to your transmitter site, be it AM, FM, or digital, it's going to be compressed to go onto the link, and it may go through another stage of compression as it goes into the transmitter. So you've got to start out as clean as you can. Otherwise, the end result's going to be disappointing for all.
Yeah.
Justified.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, so WAV files and SM7s.
Yeah, there you go.
It's the take up for today.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thanks, Des.
Cheers, guys. Thank you again for the invitation.
We got to get you back, Des. I've got about another dozen questions now.
Well, I feel like I'm part of the family now.
Yeah, exactly. That was the Pro Audio Suite. If you have any questions or ideas for a show, let us know via our Facebook, the Pro Audio Suite Podcast.
Yeah.